Hi, this is Nicholas Chen. This is my vlog on Braid. Starting off, the visual style of Braid is immediately intriguing. I'm reminded of Van Gogh's pieces with every background, giving off a whimsy adventure vibe that you'd find in a storybook. There are clear elements that call back to the mother of all platformers, Mario, but in its own style. The Goomba equivalents of bushy manes, the piranha plants have warts and vines, everything looks in its own style. The gameplay, however, cannot be matched with Mario's. Braid's gameplay is kind of misleading actually, a sort of puzzle game with platforming elements rather than being a main platformer. With Braid's main gameplay mechanic, the reversing of time, the fear of failure of missing jumps is immediately removed, which shifts the gameplay from hard platforming and fast action to methodical movements and messing with time. Already, from the first few levels, it's clear that the platforming challenges aren't overtly difficult, and the reward system isn't an easy life system, but rather it's used to solve interesting puzzles and achieve puzzle pieces. Already, the game does a great job with the tutorial, only showing basics of platforming controls and leaving the player to solve the rest. Concepts such as jumping on enemies' heads for extra height, the green dust, which means objects aren't affected by rewind, and more are understood by the player implicitly, which feeds into the puzzle-style gameplay well. The focus becomes less about making a jump over a cliff, rather than how to make the jump possible in the first place. One of the favorite mechanics was the rewind forward mechanic when you moved into the third world. It reuses a few levels of the last world, but made it into its own challenges. Simple challenges, such as hunting down enemies, becomes an entirely different beast when having to account for enemies reviving if you go too far left. The game's mechanics are all culminate what you learned in the previous world still becomes relevant for new and exciting puzzles introduced in the next. These mechanics lap over each other and make for deep, connective gameplay. Because the game is built around relatively simple platforming, the difficulty is also inviting. If there's a puzzle piece that's too hard to achieve, you can simply skip past it, moving to the next level. The game lets you interact with the mechanics enough to ease into it, making a decision if you want to play the level or not. And it's an option that's important, because some of the levels are honestly incredibly hard. The hunting level I mentioned before, I was not smart enough to figure that one out, especially with the rewind system. But getting hung up is entirely on the player, and the level system is designed as well to encourage going back to the level later, continuing the flow of the game if you decide to skip. The audio design can't be overlooked either. Each action has a distinct noise that makes the player recognize it better, and the rewind system plays the audio back in reverse as well, notifying the player when an event has been undone. The music is relaxed, enticing the player to take their time to figure out the key steps to each puzzle. Again, returning to the rewind/forward mechanic in the third world, the music would also rewind or stop depending on what was happening in the game world, which helped immensely to figure out the mechanics of the world. One thing that I felt was a misstep in the game, personally, was the narrative side. The narration is stuck to books with expository writing entirely contained at the beginning of each world, and the narration that I did read is oddly realistic for a game about turning back time to step on a Goomba-like creatures. It wasn't very well woven into gameplay puzzles, and didn't feel any sort of connection towards the narrative, nor did I feel a connection from the gameplay with the narrative either. I bring up realism as a contrast to the rest of the feel of the game, where what it was talking about topics such as failing relationships, perfection, familial issues, it all oddly fell out of place. Although the presentation fit so well, you wouldn't think it would be about real issues, but rather just the storytelling. If I also had to critique the gameplay, I would say the platforming wasn't the most exciting or interesting. Obviously, the rewind system made the risk of loss lightened, but even without it, the movement in the game felt very limited. I imagine this is to help with the precision required for rewind puzzles, but much of the puzzles included waiting around for enemies to move into place, rather than forcing the player to take any sort of action to solve it themselves. Perhaps this changes in later puzzles, but the low energy vibes didn't get me excited until after I completed the puzzle at the end. Regardless of its narrative hangups, the presentation and unique mechanics made for challenging puzzles that made me push myself to solve them, and the satisfaction of completing them is hard to top. Braid remains one of gaming's top indie games for a reason, and will continue to stand as an important cornerstone in indie gaming as a meticulously crafted platformer/puzzle.